The morning broke pale and trembling over the quiet edge of a forgotten English town, its cobblestones slick with the dew of unspent sorrow. The year was 1857, and though the frost still clung to the iron fences and the window panes of the poor, the streets had already begun to stir with the trade of milk, bread, and gossip. Through this mist of early day came a man not easily missed, tall, broad-shouldered, his fine coat worn thin from use and weather. His gloves were of good make, though cracked at the seams, and his hat, once of noble quality, bore the weight of rain and ruin. He was known to most as the Duke of Halewin, though the title had become of late a matter of quiet ridicule whispered behind the steam of morning kettles. He walked with the careful stride of a man unaccustomed to being seen, and yet painfully aware of every pair of eyes that followed him. In one arm he cradled a small bundle wrapped in wool and lace, a child his son, scarcely 2 months old. The infant's cries rose against the chill frail and insistent, as if protesting the cold world into which he had been so suddenly thrust. The Duke stopped at a modest wooden stall where glass bottles of milk glistened like captured moons in the dawn light. Behind the counter stood a milkman, cap tilted, expression wary but polite in that way the lower classes practiced when speaking to men who had once been powerful. "Morning, Your Grace," the man muttered, dipping his head. "Wasn't expecting to see you out this far from the manor." The Duke gave a faint nod, voice low and even. "The nursemaid is ill. My son needs feeding." He glanced down, adjusting the blanket around the infant, whose small lips quivered in restless hunger. The milkman hesitated, his eyes darting toward a small cluster of townsfolk gathered near the corner bakery. They were already watching. One woman whispered something behind her gloved hand. Another stifled a laugh. A duke, reduced to buying milk with his own hands, it was the sort of scene that fed a town for weeks. The Duke reached for a jug. His gloves slipped on the chilled glass, and the bottle clattered against the counter, spilling a thin stream of white across the wood. The baby began to wail. Heads turned, laughter fluttered, quick and cruel. "Look there," a man's voice called from the street, amused. "A nobleman bagging milk like a servant." The Duke froze, his jaw tightening, eyes fixed on the puddle spreading before him. For a moment he seemed carved from the same stone as the churchyard statues beyond the square, majestic still, but broken at the base. And then, cutting through the cruel chorus, came a voice, soft, clear, and trembling. "My lord," it said, "allow me." She emerged from the fog as though the morning had shaped her from its mist, tall, slender, wrapped in a faded shawl of rose wool. Her name, though few would have spoken it kindly, was Clara Whitmore. Once she had been the wife of a solicitor, a woman of education, manners, and modest beauty. But widowhood had stripped her of comfort and name alike. Now she lived in quiet lodgings near the chapel, earning little and enduring much. The Duke looked at her, uncertain, as she approached the counter. She offered a small, steady smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Your hand trembles, sir," she said softly. "May I?" He hesitated, pride and exhaustion warring within him. Around them the murmur of onlookers thickened like fog. To refuse her might preserve his dignity, but at what cost to the child still crying in his arms? He yielded. She took the jug from his hand, her fingers brushing his glove. The touch was fleeting, but in that brief contact something human, fragile, and wordless passed between them. She poured the milk cleanly into a paper bag, folded it, and handed it back with care. "Warm it slowly, my lord," she murmured. "A child's stomach can be as tender as his father's heart." The Duke blinked, startled by her tone, not pitying, but kind. "You seem well versed in care," he said. Her gaze faltered. "I have buried 2 children, your grace." One learns. The silence that followed was heavy and aching. Even the townsfolk fell still, as though the frost itself had tightened around their throats. The Duke bowed his head, his voice roughened by something close to shame. "Then you know more of courage than I." She looked up at him then, and though her face was pale and worn, there was a steadiness in her that caught him off guard, a quiet resilience that had not yet yielded to despair. The baby whimpered again, and she stepped closer, reaching out her arms. "May I?" she asked. He hesitated, then nodded. The child passed from his arms into hers, as though it were the most natural act in the world. Clara cradled him with a grace that needed no rehearsal, her lips whispering soft words of comfort as she swayed gently, as if dancing with memory itself. Within moments the crying ceased. The Duke watched, transfixed, his breath caught in his chest. Around them the street carried on, vendors calling, carts rolling, the town resuming its hum of indifferent life. Yet for a fleeting instant it seemed the world had narrowed to the space between the Duke's weary gaze and Clara's trembling hands. "Does he have a name?" she asked quietly. "Henry," he replied. "For my father." "A fine name," she said, her eyes softening as she looked at the sleeping child. "May he grow to bear it with gentleness?" He inclined his head. "You speak as though gentleness were a virtue." "It is," she said. "The rarest of them all." Their eyes met, his dark and hollow, hers lit with something that dared to hope. And for that single moment he almost believed that grace might yet be found amid ruin. But then the spell broke. A door opened across the street, and a matron in a stiff bonnet called out sharply, "Mrs. Whitmore!" "Do not shame yourself further, woman. Go home." The onlookers' laughter returned, low and poisonous. Clara's shoulders stiffened, but she did not move. The Duke turned toward them, his expression cool. "Commanding, madam," he said evenly, "if compassion offends you, I beg you not to look upon it." The matron faltered, caught between fear and outrage, and shut her door with a huff. Clara handed the child back, her voice low. "You should go, my lord. They will not forget what they've seen." "Nor will I," he said quietly. She hesitated, then curtsied. "God keep you, your grace. And you, Mrs. Whitmore." He turned the child in his arms and began the slow walk back through the mist. Behind him the whispers resumed, half ashamed, half delighted. But Clara remained still at the milk stall, her hands pressed to her chest where the warmth of the child still lingered. The narrator's voice would later recall that morning as the moment two lives, equally fallen from grace, brushed against destiny. For in a society that mistook kindness for weakness, the simple act of feeding a stranger's child would prove to be the spark that set hearts and reputations aflame. And as the Duke's figure vanished into the pale fog, Clara Whitmore whispered to the empty air, almost to herself, "Strange! How mercy always finds the lonely first." The mist swallowed her words whole, carrying them into the hush of morning, where scandal was already taking shape like ink upon paper. The days that followed the mist-shrouded morning unfolded with a quiet inevitability, as though fate itself had chosen its course long before either of them drew breath. Word of the Duke of Halloween's descent from privilege had already been a favored morsel among the genteel drawing-rooms of the town. But now there was something new to chew upon, something sweeter, more scandalous. A widow of no fortune, Mrs. Clara Whitmore, had been seen cradling the Duke's infant son in the open street, as tenderly as any mother might. The story spread faster than fire through dry grass, embroidered with every retelling. By the end of the week, the tale had reached even the candlelit parlors of London society, where gossip ripened like fruit left too long in the sun. Yet in the small village on the edge of the Duke's estate, something gentler was unfolding, hidden beneath the noise of rumor. Each morning Clara would walk the frost-tipped lane to the Duke's modest cottage, a place he had retreated to after selling the grand Halowen Manor to pay his late wife's debts. She came not as a servant nor as a supplicant, but as one human soul answering the cry of another. On the third morning, when she arrived with a jug of warmed milk wrapped in her shawl, she found him outside splitting kindling. His sleeves rolled past his elbows, breath clouding in the chill. The sight startled her. He looked less a duke and more a man, muscles taut beneath linen, eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. "You should not trouble yourself, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, setting aside the axe. "You owe me no charity," she smiled faintly, though her cheeks burned with cold. "It is no trouble, my lord. The child's cries carry clear to the road. I thought perhaps he might take better to this than the milk you've been buying." "It is goat's milk, warmed with honey." He hesitated, his pride stiff as his posture, but her tone left little room for refusal. He nodded, gesturing toward the door. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the faint scent of damp wool. The cradle sat by the hearth, the child within stirring weakly. Clara moved to him at once, her hand steady as she lifted the infant, humming low under her breath. The Duke stood behind her, uncertain. "He sleeps little," he said quietly, "as if he cannot bear peace for too long." "Then he is his father's son," she murmured, rocking the child. He blinked at that, unsure whether to take offense or comfort. She turned then, her eyes catching the firelight. "You look unwell, my lord. You've taken too much upon yourself." "I can bear it," she studied him. All men believe they can bear what will until they cannot. Something in her voice, soft but resolute, disarmed him. He found himself watching the way the firelight touched the strands of her hair, the way her expression held both weariness and grace. When she laid the child back in his cradle, he cleared his throat. "I've little to offer for your kindness," he said, "but you have done me a service I cannot forget." He crossed to a small chest near the wall, rummaging until he found a small box of silver. From within he withdrew a spoon, engraved finely with curling vines and the initials H.H. "This belonged to my father," he said. "It was meant for Henry's christening. I would ask you to accept it as a token of gratitude." Clara shook her head at once. "I could not, my lord. It would not be proper. I no longer concern myself with propriety," he said with a faint, tired smile, "only with truth. And the truth is that you have saved me from despair more than once, and my son from hunger. You will take it." Her hesitation lasted only a moment longer. Then, seeing that refusal would wound him more deeply than acceptance, she nodded. "Then I will keep it, not as payment, but as remembrance." He inclined his head. "That will do." Outside, the wind rattled against the shutters. Within, for the first time since his wife's death, the Duke felt something almost like peace. He watched as Clara wrapped the child's blanket more tightly and bent to kiss the infant's brow. The sight stirred in him a tenderness that frightened him, a tenderness he had thought buried with his dead. But the world beyond that quiet room was not so merciful. Within days, whispers began to bloom anew, their roots twisting through the town like creeping ivy. The silver spoon became the seed of rumor, its existence transformed into proof of sin. They said the Duke had given her a lover's token, that the widow had ensnared him with her care. By the time word reached the parish, the tale had grown teeth. Clara heard it first in the market, two matrons clucking as she passed. Feeding the Duke's child, they say. And feeding him too, if the stories hold. Disgraceful. Widows should know their place. Clara felt the heat rise to her cheeks, but held her head high, though every word struck like a lash. That night she sat in her small room by the window, the spoon in her palm, glinting faintly in the candlelight. It was beautiful, too beautiful, she thought, for a woman like her. With trembling hands she wrapped it in a scrap of linen. The next morning she returned it to him. He met her at the door, surprise flashing in his eyes as she extended the small bundle toward him. "What is this?" "The spoon," she said softly. "You must take it back, my lord. They speak ill of you, of me." "Let them speak," he said coldly. "I have endured worse." "I have not," she whispered. "They have little enough to say kindly of me. I will not have your ruin added to my own." His eyes darkened. "Do you think I gave it to you out of pity?" "I think," she said steady now, "that you gave it out of gratitude." But gratitude can become a weapon in cruel mouths. "You must see that." He reached for her hand, pressing the silver back into her palm. His voice dropped to a whisper rough with conviction. "Then let their mouths starve. Keep it, Mrs. Whitmore. I would rather face ruin again than see you hunger for kindness." The words struck her like thunder, too fierce, too honest. For a moment neither moved. The child stirred softly in his cradle, the only sound between them. Then Clara stepped back, the spoon clutched tightly in her hand. "Your ruin is not mine to bear," she said. "But I will pray it does not come." When she turned to leave, he called after her, his voice stripped of formality, bare as the wind that swept the moors. "Clara," she paused at the door. "Do not let them make you small," he said. "They will try again and again." "Do not let them." Her eyes shimmered, though no tears fell. "Then do not let them break you, my lord." And she was gone. Long after the door closed, he stood staring at the empty air where she had been. the echo of her name lingering in his mind like the scent of rain on stone. The silver spoon gleamed in his hand, a symbol not of scandal or sin, but of something rarer, a grace neither of them yet understood, and which the world in its blindness would surely try to destroy. The storm came without mercy. By dusk the wind howled through the trees like a chorus of ghosts, and the rain fell in relentless sheets that blurred the hills into shadow. At Hallowen Cottage every window shuddered, and the fire in the hearth hissed beneath the draught. The Duke stood at the cradle, sleeves rolled, eyes fixed upon his son's pale face. The child had been feverish since morning, restless, coughing, his breath shallow and uneven. He had sent the servant for the physician hours ago, yet the door remained unopened. The road impassable in the storm. He had done everything he could, cooled the boy's forehead, warmed the milk, prayed without sound. But still, Henry's small chest rose and fell in uneven rhythm, and with each breath the Duke felt another piece of himself unravel. His hand, the same that once signed decrees and managed estates, now trembled helplessly above the cradle. He did not hear the knock at first. It was soft, hesitant, then again firmer. The door creaked open, and through the rain and wind came a figure cloaked in dark wool, soaked to the bone. "My lord," Clara Whitmore said breathlessly, pulling back her hood. Her cheeks were flushed with cold, her hair damp and clinging to her face. "The physician cannot come. He's trapped beyond the bridge." "I came as soon as I heard." The Duke turned, startled. "You should not have come out in this weather. You'll fall ill yourself. I've seen worse storms," she said, stepping forward, her eyes going at once to the cradle. "How long has he been like this?" "Since dawn. He won't take milk." His voice cracked raw with exhaustion. "He barely breathes now." She crossed to the hearth, unwrapping her shawl, and knelt beside the child. Her hands were gentle, practiced, checking the boy's pulse, his forehead, the color of his lips. Then, with a steadiness that seemed borrowed from heaven itself, she whispered, "He will not die tonight." He looked at her as if he could not believe such certainty could exist in the same room as grief. "You cannot know that." "I do," she said simply, lifting the child. "Because he has someone who refuses to give up on him." Her voice was soft, but beneath it was steel. She dipped a cloth in cool water, wiping the boy's face, humming a lullaby beneath her breath. The melody, simple, aching, seemed to ease the fever's hold. Slowly the child's cries quieted into whimpers. For a long time neither spoke. The rain battered the roof, and the candlelight flickered across the wooden floor. The Duke watched her, the way she moved without fear or hesitation, as if the chaos outside could not touch her so long as there was a life to tend to. "At last," he said quietly, "you should not involve yourself further. The scandal already gnaws at your name." She smiled faintly. "My name is already dust, my lord. What can ruin do to what is already ruined?" He looked away, jaw tight. "I know that pain." Her hand stilled for a moment. "You think I came tonight out of pity. But pity has no place in what I feel." He turned to her then, the words catching. "And what is it you feel, Mrs. Whitmore?" She did not answer at once. The child stirred, and she rocked him gently. When she spoke again, her voice was low, almost afraid of itself. "I see in you the same hunger I once saw in myself, the hunger to be forgiven, though you've done nothing wrong, but live in a world that punishes tenderness." He stared at her, struck silent. The rain lashed harder against the windows, and the fire burned lower. "My wife," he said finally, voice hollow, "was a good woman, but we were strangers from the day we wed. I married her because the house demanded it. She gave me an heir, and I gave her nothing worth keeping. She died giving birth to my son, and I—" his voice broke. "I mourned not her loss, but the guilt that I had never loved her. What man could confess such sin?" Clara looked up, her gaze steady. "A man who has carried too much silence." He drew a long, uneven breath. "I thought I might learn to live differently, that perhaps devotion to the boy might redeem me. But the world sees a grieving husband, a fallen nobleman, a fool who stoops to feed his own child. There is no mercy for those who love too earnestly." "There never is," she said. The words hung between them, tender and terrible. He stepped closer, the firelight catching in his eyes. "And you? What life was stolen from you, Mrs. Whitmore?" She hesitated, then sighed. I married for love, or what I thought was love. My husband was charming, ambitious, and kind when the sun was out. But debts make strangers of men, and when his creditors came, he fled with their money and left me with shame. They said he drowned himself crossing the channel. I do not know if that is mercy or punishment. Her voice quavered, but she did not weep. After that, I was a widow without a grave to mourn, and the world found ways to remind me of it. Doors closed, friends vanished. I learned that compassion is a currency most will not spend on the poor. The Duke's hands curled at his sides. Then we are both ghosts, he said softly, living among the living unseen until the world decides to mock us. Clara met his eyes. And yet here we are, two ghosts, keeping a child alive. Something in him broke then, not loudly but deeply, like a rope snapping in the dark. He took a step nearer, his voice barely more than a whisper. You should not be here. I know, it is not proper. I know that too. Then why stay? She looked at him, eyes glimmering in the firelight. Because if I leave, you will break. The simplicity of it struck him like a blow. He turned away, pacing once, twice, before stopping near the window. The storm clawed at the glass, and his reflection stared back at him, a hollow echo of what he once was. He spoke without facing her. I fear the world more than death, Mrs. Whitmore. Death is silent. The world, he exhaled, shaking his head. The world whispers. She stood, the child still in her arms. Let it whisper. Let it scream. It cannot take what it cannot understand. He faced her then, eyes dark and fierce. And what is that? Mercy, she said simply. You have it, my lord, and it frightens them. The silence that followed was almost holy. The rain softened, the fire steadied. Clara set the sleeping child back into his cradle and turned to leave. At the door she paused, her voice trembling slightly. You cannot atone for what you did not choose, but you can choose what becomes of you now. He stepped forward, his voice low, weighted with meaning. If compassion be my ruin, then let it be at your hands. Her breath caught. For an instant, time itself seemed to hold. Then she curtsied, her eyes shining with something unspoken. Then may we both be ruined kindly, she whispered, and as she stepped into the rain once more, the Duke watched her vanish into the storm, the echo of her words lingering long after the door closed, leaving the house filled with the fragile silence of hope newly born. Winter arrived with a cruel kind of beauty, snowfall as silent as guilt, and frost that glittered like judgment upon every roof of Halloween. The Duke's cottage, once isolated by disgrace, now stood beneath the gaze of society once more. For months the whispers had grown louder, festered, reshaped by envy into scandal. The widow Whitmore, they murmured, has bewitched the Duke. The milkmaid who fed his child will soon feed upon his fortune. The Duke read none of it, yet he heard it all in the quiet disdain of servants, in the sidelong glances of those who once bowed to him. Still he did not waver. He had lived through the venom of pity. Rumor was only its cheaper cousin. The invitations began to arrive after the new year, the formal gestures of reconciliation from a society that pretended forgiveness while savoring the taste of gossip. Among them lay one that mattered most, a letter from Lord Pembroke, his oldest friend and rival, inviting him to the winter ball at Halloween Hall, his own ancestral estate, now no longer his by title but still by memory. The Duke stared at it for a long while before deciding. He would attend. Let them all see him, no longer as a fallen noble, but as a man unashamed. When he sent an invitation to Clara Whitmore, she thought it must have been a mistake. The ink was neat, the tone courteous, but beneath its restraint she sensed something defiant. You are cordially invited to the winter ball, it read, to attend as my guest and equal. She almost tore it in half. They will destroy you for this, she murmured aloud, hands trembling. Yet even as reason pleaded, her heart whispered otherwise. And so, on the night of the ball, when the carriages lined the grand avenue and lanterns glowed like stars upon the snow, Clara Whitmore arrived at Halloween Hall in a gown of muted silver and lace, simple, elegant, unbejeweled. She stepped from the carriage to a hush that rippled through the gathered crowd. Whispers moved faster than breath. The widow is here. Inside, chandeliers blazed. The air hummed with perfume, violin strings, and concealed malice. The Duke stood near the staircase, tall and composed in a black coat, tailored to austere perfection. The sight of him silenced her breath. He was not the weary man she'd once tended by the fire. He was every inch a duke once more, though his gaze, when it found her, softened with something human and unguarded. Every head turned as he crossed the room. Conversations faltered, fans stilled. When he reached her, he bowed, not with condescension, but reverence. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice even. "You honor me," her reply came softly, almost trembling. "You should not have asked me to come. And yet you did." The orchestra swelled. The first waltz began. He extended his hand. "Will you dance with me?" She hesitated, aware of the sea of eyes upon them. "If I do, it will not be forgotten." "Then let it be remembered," he said. She placed her hand in his. As they moved to the floor, the crowd parted like waves around them. Every step, every turn was a quiet act of rebellion. Her hand rested lightly in his, her eyes lifted to his face, and though neither spoke, the air between them trembled with all that had gone unsaid. The violins rose higher. He leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "I am told this dance will end whatever name I have left." "Then why do it?" She breathed. "Because I am weary of being half a man." "You taught me the other half," her eyes glistened, though she smiled faintly. "And you taught me not to bow to shame." They turned once more, their reflections gliding in the mirrored walls, a duke and a widow, scandal and grace entwined. The music slowed, and as the final chord lingered, so did their gaze. But the room did not forgive. From the crowd's edge, a woman's voice, sharp and poisonous, cut through the applause. "How fitting," she said loudly. The Duke and his milkmaid. Laughter scattered like glass across the floor. Clara froze, color draining from her face. The Duke stopped, still holding her hand. His expression did not change, but the silence that followed was taut as a drawn blade. He turned toward the voice, a lady in green silk, her smirk delicate as poison ivy. The Duke's voice, when he spoke, was calm, but carried through the hall like a judgment. "Madam," he said, "you mock a woman whose virtue surpasses the sum of every title in this room. You may call her what you wish." "I call her Grace," a murmur rippled. No one laughed now. The lady's fan trembled in her hand. Clara tried to step away, but he caught her wrist, not roughly, but with purpose. "You need not—" she began. "I must," he said, and before she could protest further, he lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it, not with the distant courtesy of rank, but with reverence and finality. Gasps broke through the room. Someone dropped a glass. The orchestra faltered. And yet he did not release her hand. "I have lived by their measure long enough," he said, his voice ringing through the hall. "No longer." Clara's eyes filled, though she held herself still. "You have made yourself their enemy. Then let me be hated for truth, rather than loved for pretense." She wanted to speak, to stop him, to thank him, to plead for reason. But the words died beneath the weight of the moment. Lord Pembroke stepped forward then, breaking the silence. "Halloween," he said slowly, "you realize what you've done?" "Yes," the Duke replied, without hesitation. "I've told the truth." For a heartbeat, it seemed the hall itself breathed with him. Then Pembroke inclined his head. "Then, old friend, perhaps truth deserves a toast." The tension broke like thawing ice. The orchestra struck up again, soft, uncertain, but alive. Yet for all the resumed civility, the scandal was sealed. No one would forget the sight, the Duke's lips upon a widow's hand beneath the chandelier's blaze. When the music swelled once more, Clara leaned closer, whispering so only he could hear. "You have destroyed every bridge behind you," he smiled faintly, eyes fierce and unrepentant. "Then we shall build new ones together. And though the world beyond the ballroom would surely turn its back come morning, that night, beneath the glittering chandeliers of Halloween Hall, the fallen Duke and the widowed outcast stood as equals, not in birth, nor wealth, but in courage." The waltz faded. Applause returned, hesitant, uncertain. Yet, within that uncertain noise, something truer stirred, something that sounded faintly like respect, for in that gilded room of judgment and masks, two ruined hearts had dared to choose mercy over fear, and in doing so, they had rewritten the very meaning of nobility. Morning broke over Halloween like a wound refusing to close. The snow had melted overnight, leaving the road slick with mud and shame. By dawn, the scandal of the Duke's public declaration had spread from drawing rooms to broadsheets, each retelling sharper, crueler than the last. A Duke's madness, they called it. The milkmaid's triumph. The widow's snare. At the cottage, the fire had long gone cold. The Duke sat at his desk, reading letter after letter, most severing ties, a few mocking in polite phrasing, none kind. The crest of his own family's council appeared on one envelope. Its message was brief and final. His titles, it said, would be suspended pending royal review. His income frozen. His estates claimed in debt. He closed his eyes and let the silence settle. It was not despair that filled him now, but a strange, hollow peace. He had spent half a lifetime chained to reputation. Now, with nothing left to guard, he felt free. The door creaked open behind him. "You should not be here," he said softly, without turning. "I had to see you." Clara's voice was steady, though her hand shook beneath her cloak. "They say you've lost everything," he smiled faintly. "Not everything." She stepped closer, the faint scent of lavender rising from her cloak. "You call this peace? To sit among ruins?" "Ruins are honest," he said. "They do not pretend to be anything but what they are." Her breath caught. "I never meant to bring this upon you." He turned then, his eyes gentler than she remembered. "You gave me no wound I did not choose to bear. What I did with clear mind and full heart. But they'll cast you out, my lord. You'll be shunned, impoverished, then let them." He stood, his voice calm but unyielding. "I have seen the face of hypocrisy in every hall of power. I have heard compassion spoken as sin, and I will not kneel to it again." For a long moment neither spoke. The baby stirred in his cradle, the sound small and fragile in the vast quiet. Clara turned toward him, her expression softening. "He sleeps so peacefully," she whispered, "as though he knows nothing of what the world has done." "Let him keep that innocence as long as he can," the Duke said. A knock came suddenly, firm, deliberate. Clara startled. The Duke motioned her aside and opened the door. There stood Lord Pembroke, coat dusted with frost, face grave but not unkind. "Halloween," he said, bowing his head slightly. "You look well. For a man the world believes damned." "I've been damned before," the Duke replied. "I find it less frightening the second time." Pembroke's lips twitched in something like admiration. "You've made quite the spectacle. You've undone every boundary that kept you safe. Society has no room for men who love too plainly." "I have no room left for its cruelty," the Duke said. Pembroke stepped forward, lowering his voice. "There's still time to mend this. A letter to the papers, a public apology. Deny any intent. Claim the widow misled you. It will all fade by spring." The Duke's silence was answer enough. Pembroke sighed. "Then you truly mean to see this through?" "I mean to live honestly," the Duke said. "Whatever remains to me, let it at least be true." Pembroke's gaze shifted toward Clara. "And you, Mrs. Whitmore, will you let him throw away his birthright for your sake?" Clara met his eyes. "He throws nothing away that was not already lost." The older man studied her, then nodded once, curtly. "Then God help you both." When the door closed, the Duke turned to her. "There, the last of my allies gone." "Not the last," she said softly. The hours that followed passed in silence, broken only by the crackle of rekindled fire. Outside, the storm that had haunted them all winter began to fade into mist. Clara stood by the window, watching the horizon pale. "I should leave before dawn," she murmured. "They will hunt you harder if I stay." He crossed the room, his expression unreadable. "And where will you go? To a world that has already turned its back?" "I have survived their cruelty before." He shook his head. "I will not watch you vanish into it again." Her eyes shone with something between sorrow and defiance. "You cannot stop me." "No," he said quietly, "but I can follow." She stared at him, the words catching in her throat. "You would abandon everything for me?" "I already did," he said simply. A long silence fell between them, filled only by the whisper of wind through the cracks. Then she said, "They will not forgive us. They never did. And your son?" He looked toward the cradle where Henry slept, bathed in golden firelight. "He will grow knowing that his father chose kindness over pride. That will be his inheritance." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but her voice held firm. You would walk into exile for mercy's sake. I would, he said. But not exile, freedom. The faint whistle of a distant train broke the silence. The early departure bound south, its smoke rising like a summons. Clara turned toward the sound, her breath quickening. The morning train, she murmured. It leaves within the hour, he met her gaze. Then let us not miss it. They packed little, a satchel for the child, a coat for him, her shawl. When they stepped into the dawn, the air smelled of wet earth and renewal. The path down the hill was slick, but he held her steady. Their steps matched, their silence full of purpose. At the station, the few travelers stared but said nothing. The Duke, once the pride of Halloween, now stood among them as one of their own, coat threadbare, eyes alight with something fierce and unrepentant. Clara cradled the child, her face pale with both fear and hope. When the train hissed and the doors opened, she turned to him. "You could still stay," she whispered. "Rebuild." "Beg pardon," he took her hand. "Well, for what crime?" "Loving what was good?" The words silenced her. They boarded together, taking seats near the window. As the train lurched forward, the town fell away behind them, spires fading, smoke curling, the old life dissolving into fog. Clara leaned against him, eyes closing. "And where will we go?" "Where mercy is not mistaken for madness," he said. "If such a place exists," she smiled faintly. "And if it does not, then we shall build it." Outside, the dawn broke wider, scattering gold across the rails. The narrator might have said that the Duke of Halloween died that morning, but he did not. He simply shed his title, his chains, and the weight of a world that prized appearance over grace. As the train disappeared into the mist, only the echo of its whistle remained, a sound not of loss, but of beginning, and so ended the tale of the Duke and the widow, who found nobility not in rank or wealth, but in mercy, mercy that dared the world to call it ruin, and by daring made it divine.